The water off Hormuz is calm, almost flat, when the first contact appears on radar, then another, then a dozen more, closing fast, cutting serpentine wakes across the strait toward an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer standing between Iran's coastline and the open Gulf of Oman. Bridge-to-bridge radio crackles with warnings. No response comes back. Weapons uncovered, the sailor's voice reports, tight with the discipline of someone trained not to sound afraid. This is May 7th, 2026, and it is not a drill. Within hours, American 5-inch guns and close-in weapon systems are firing to hold the swarm off the ship's hull. What happens next in that engagement will decide more than one night in the Persian Gulf. It will force the United States Navy to show its hand and reveal a strategy the public hasn't fully understood until now. To understand why this moment was inevitable, you have to understand what's been building in the Strait of Hormuz since April. This narrow channel between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula is one of the most valuable stretches of water on Earth. Roughly a quarter of the world's seaborne oil trade passes through it, along with fuel and fertilizer shipments that keep economies running from Tokyo to Rotterdam. And by early May, that traffic had all but stopped. The standoff began weeks earlier. On April 13th, 2026, the United States imposed a naval blockade on Iran, targeting vessels moving in and out of Iranian ports in the Gulf of Oman. Iran called it a violation of a fragile ceasefire and warned it would respond. It did, closing off shipping lanes of its own, leaving commercial vessels stranded on both sides of the strait, unwilling to risk the crossing. Overseeing the American side of this confrontation is Admiral Brad Cooper, head of U.S. Central Command, the man whose briefings, statements, and decisions would come to define how Washington handled the crisis in the weeks ahead. His voice and CENTCOM's official updates are the closest thing to ground truth in a fast-moving, high-stakes standoff most Americans were only half watching. This wasn't some remote skirmish in a place that doesn't touch your life. Every day the strait stayed choked, oil markets felt it. Every ship turned back, added pressure to global shipping schedules already strained by months of regional war. The blockade and the counter-blockade were a slow-motion collision. Two militaries, one vital choke point, and an economy on the other end of the line. That was the backdrop. Then, on May 7th, it stopped being background noise. Confirmed event. That was the backdrop. Then, on May 7th, it stopped being background noise. 3 American destroyers, USS Mason, USS Rafael Peralta, and USS Truxtun, were transiting the Strait of Hormuz, threading through waters that hadn't seen normal commercial traffic in weeks. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps had other plans. Missiles, drones, and fast attack boats came at the American ships in waves, converging from multiple directions at once, forcing each destroyer's crew to track threats above the water, on it, and skimming just over it simultaneously. The response was layered by design. 5-inch naval guns opened up on the larger threats. Close-in weapon systems, the last line of defense against anything that got too close, engaged what got through. Sailors manning small-caliber guns on deck fired on the boats themselves as they closed distance, while supporting aircraft worked the airspace overhead. It was, by the account of U.S. officials speaking to reporters, a fiercer and more sustained assault than a similar barrage the same ships had faced just days before. Proof that Iran wasn't testing the water anymore. It was pressing. The United States didn't just defend. Within the same window, American forces struck back at the source, hitting Iranian missile and drone launch sites tied to the assault. A retaliatory strike meant to blunt the threat before it could be repeated. And when the smoke cleared, the U.S. Navy's own account was unambiguous. Every incoming threat was defeated. No American ship was hit. 3 destroyers, one of the world's most contested waterways, and a swarm attack sustained enough to draw comparisons to the worst of the prior week. And still, not a single American vessel took a hit. That's the number that matters here. Not because it settles the danger, but because it's the one hard, verified fact standing at the center of everything that follows. The swarm came, the guns answered, and the ships held. The engagement was over in hours. The reaction, on both sides, was just getting started. The engagement was over in hours. The reaction, on both sides, was just getting started. CENTCOM went public almost immediately, confirming the swarm, the strikes, and the outcome for anyone watching to see. Tehran told a different story. Iran framed the American naval presence itself as the provocation, insisting that U.S. warships operating near the strait amounted to a breach of the ceasefire both sides had agreed to just weeks earlier. In Iran's telling, Washington was the one escalating. Then came the countermove. On May 7th, the same day American guns were firing on swarming boats, Iran stood up something new, the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, a body created to vet and toll every vessel attempting to pass through waters. Tehran now claimed the right to control. It was a bureaucratic answer to a military problem, and it worked. Lloyd's List, the shipping industry's most trusted tracker of maritime traffic, reported that transits through the strait had effectively stopped since May 4th. By their count, roughly 1,500 vessels sat stranded, going nowhere. Waiting on a crisis, neither government showed signs of de-escalating. And this wasn't a two-country story either. The United Arab Emirates, sitting just across the water, confirmed it was actively engaging Iranian missiles and drones during the same stretch. Its own air defense systems intercepting threats meant for someone else's fight, but landing in its airspace regardless. One nation's naval standoff had already become a regional scramble, with a Gulf ally absorbing fire it never asked for, two governments accusing each other of breaking the peace, 1,500 ships going nowhere, a third country shooting down missiles overhead. That's the temperature of the Strait of Hormuz by the second week of May. But beneath the headlines about boats and gunfire, the Navy's own briefings were revealing something the public hadn't fully clocked yet. But beneath the headlines about boats and gunfire, the Navy's own briefings were revealing something the public hadn't fully clocked yet. Admiral Cooper had already said it plainly, days before the swarm attack made headlines. The American operation to reopen the strait, codenamed Project Freedom, was inherently a defensive operation, not an escort mission, not a convoy system. Say those words slowly, because they matter more than they sound like they should. Here's what that distinction actually means on the water. In a classic escort operation, a warship stays with a merchant vessel, hull to hull, guiding it through danger from start to finish. Project Freedom doesn't work that way. Commercial ships transit on their own bottoms in Navy language, while American destroyers, aircraft, and unmanned systems operate nearby, watching, feeding real-time maritime domain awareness back to captains, deciding whether it's safe to move. It's protection at a distance, not protection at the hip, and that's a strategic choice with real exposure built into it. The evidence that shippers understood the risk came fast. By noon Eastern on the Monday, the operation launched. Only 2 U.S.-flagged merchant vessels had actually attempted the crossing. 2. Out of a strait choked with roughly 1,500 stranded ships, only 2 captains were willing to test the American umbrella that first day. That's the quiet risk sitting underneath this entire strategy. The United States had just proven, in gunfire and 5-inch shells, that the threat in these waters was real enough to require a full defensive response. And the plan it chose to answer that threat with was the lighter footprint option. Fewer ships tied directly to each transit, more reliance on a broad protective net holding across a wide and contested stretch of water. It's a bet that the umbrella is strong enough without being everywhere at once. On day one, almost nobody was ready to test that bet. The gap between plan and proof is exactly where the bigger strategy comes into focus. The bigger strategic picture. That gap between plan and proof is exactly where the bigger strategy comes into focus. On May 4th, CENTCOM laid out exactly what Project Freedom was built from. Ballistic missile defense-capable destroyers. More than 100 aircraft, split between land bases and carrier decks, multi-domain unmanned platforms, under the sea, on the surface, and in the air, all feeding the same picture back to commanders. And roughly 15,000 American service members, running this mission at the same time as the ongoing blockade of Iranian ports, not instead of it. Admiral Cooper gave it a name that stuck, a defensive umbrella stretched across one of the most dangerous stretches of water on the planet. But the military piece was only half of it. Alongside Project Freedom, the State Department was building something quieter. The Maritime Freedom Construct, approved by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, designed to coordinate partner nations around shared maritime security in the Gulf. And its guest list said as much as its purpose. Russia, China, Belarus, and Cuba were explicitly excluded from the outreach. This wasn't a broad coalition of everyone with a stake in Gulf shipping. It was a deliberately drawn line, built around who Washington considered a trustworthy partner in this specific fight, and who it didn't. Put those two pieces together, and you're looking at the real plan this video opened with. Not a hidden doctrine, not a secret weapon, but a publicly stated 2-track architecture. Military assets absorbing the risk on the water. Diplomatic assets narrowing who gets a seat at the table on land. Read together, these moves suggest a strategy built to thread a very specific needle. Committing enough force to keep the strait viable without locking the Navy into the kind of full-scale, ship-by-ship escort commitment that would strain resources for months, maybe years, if the standoff dragged on. Walking away from the strait, on the other hand, was never a real option, not with a quarter of the world's oil trade running through it. What Cooper described publicly as an umbrella looks, when you step back, like the middle path between two strategies the United States couldn't afford: total commitment and total absence. That's the plan at the strategic level. Now watch what it actually costs, starting close to home. Ripple effect, regional. That's the plan at the strategic level. Now watch what it actually costs, starting close to home. 1,500 vessels. That's the number sitting at anchor, dead in the water up and down both approaches to the Strait of Hormuz. Container ships, tankers, bulk carriers, all waiting on a crisis with no clear end date. 1,500 crews, 1,500 cargo manifests, 1,500 companies losing money every day. Their ships sit still instead of moving product to market. And it isn't just about numbers stacking up offshore. Iran's new Persian Gulf Strait Authority means every one of those vessels now has to reckon with a body that didn't exist 2 weeks earlier, one that vets who passes and tolls what gets through, reshaping the basic rules of transit in real time. Shipping companies that spent decades treating Hormuz as open water are now negotiating passage through an authority stood up in the middle of an active military standoff. The exposure doesn't stop at the shoreline either. The United Arab Emirates spent the same stretch actively engaging Iranian missiles and drones with its own air defense systems, a Gulf nation absorbing direct military risk for a fight that started between Washington and Tehran. That's the regional picture in full. A stranded fleet numbering in the thousands, a new gatekeeper controlling the water, and at least one neighboring country already shooting down incoming threats meant for someone else's war. A regional bottleneck like that doesn't stay regional for long, not when a quarter of the world's oil runs through this exact water. A regional bottleneck like that doesn't stay regional for long, not when a quarter of the world's oil runs through this exact water. Zoom out far enough, and this stops being a story about boats and boarding parties. It becomes a story about every gas pump, every refinery, every energy contract priced against uncertainty in the Gulf. Roughly a quarter of the world's seaborne oil trade moves through the Strait of Hormuz. There is no substitute route that carries that volume, no pipeline network built to absorb what a closed strait takes offline. When Hormuz slows down, oil markets feel it within hours, not weeks. And by early May, Hormuz wasn't slowing down, it was largely closed. Washington understood exactly what that meant, and its response tells you how seriously the risk was being treated at the highest levels. The U.S. moved to have its own International Development Finance Corporation step in and offer political risk insurance and guarantees for maritime trade passing through the Gulf. The federal government effectively underwriting the danger shipping companies were no longer willing to absorb on their own. That's not a symbolic gesture. That's Washington, putting real financial backing behind the bet that global trade through this choke point has to keep functioning one way or another. Trace the scale of this all the way through, and the shift is stark. It starts as a swarm of small boats converging on a single destroyer. It becomes a national standoff between 2 blockades and 1,500 stranded ships. And by the time it reaches oil markets and federal insurance guarantees, it's a global exposure problem, touching economies that have never heard of USS Mason or USS Truxtun and never will. Most coverage stops there. Ships, oil, standoff. But that's not where the real story is. The twist? Who really benefits? Chas loses. Most coverage stops there. Ships, oil, standoff. But that's not where the real story is. Here's what everyone assumes. This is a two-sided story. Washington against Tehran, American destroyers against Iranian speedboats, one side's blockade against the others. What actually happened tells you it's already bigger than that. Amid the disruption, Iran seized the Ocean Koi, an oil tanker that is Chinese-owned, pulling a third nation's commercial vessel directly into a conflict it has no formal role in. And China wasn't invited to help fix any of it either. Beijing sat outside the maritime freedom construct entirely, explicitly excluded alongside Russia, Belarus, and Cuba from Washington's coordination effort to stabilize the strait. Sit with that for a second, because the irony runs deep. China has spent months leaning diplomatically toward Iran, running joint naval exercises alongside Iranian forces, positioning itself as a partner rather than an adversary in the region. And yet, when the crisis actually hit the water, it was a Chinese-owned tanker that got seized, not because Beijing chose a side in this fight, but because neutrality doesn't protect cargo when a choke point this important shuts down. That's the angle most Western coverage skips entirely. China's ships are absorbing risk in a war Beijing isn't fighting, a direct consequence of standing close to Iran without standing inside Washington's protective structure. And then there's the other quiet winner in all of this, the one nobody puts in a headline. Political risk insurers and shipping intermediaries are sitting in exactly the right position to profit as Gulf transit premiums spike. Their risk now partially backstopped by U.S. government guarantees flowing through that federal insurance program. Every stranded ship, every hesitant captain, every company too nervous to send a vessel through Hormuz without coverage is a customer for someone else's balance sheet. The swarm attack that opened this story made headlines. The insurance markets quietly pricing in that danger made money. So no, this was never as clean as 2 navies facing off in open water. A neutral country's tanker gets seized. A neutral country gets left off the invite list. And somewhere in the middle, an entire industry built around risk is doing just fine. None of this is unprecedented either. This exact vulnerability was demonstrated on paper more than 20 years ago. Historicals toss comparative context. None of this is unprecedented either. This exact vulnerability was demonstrated on paper more than 20 years ago. Back in 2002, the U.S. military ran its own war game called Millennium Challenge and handed command of the opposing force to retired Marine General Paul Van Riper. His assignment was to think like an adversary who couldn't match American firepower ship for ship. His answer was speed and coordination instead of size. Van Riper sent small boats and missiles at the simulated American fleet in tight, synchronized waves, deliberately avoiding conventional radio traffic that defenses would expect to detect and track. In minutes, 16 major warships were sunk on paper, including a simulated aircraft carrier. That result rattled the Pentagon enough to study it for 2 decades afterward. It's the reason swarm tactics have never been treated as a theoretical threat inside U.S. naval planning. What happened in the Strait of Hormuz on May 7th wasn't some new tactic Iran invented. It was the same vulnerability, tested on paper in 2002, showing up live in open water 24 years later. That history is exactly why the Navy isn't pretending this problem is solved. Here's what we actually know. The swarm attack happened. 3 destroyers held the line, and not 1 American ship was hit. Project Freedom is real, with real ships, real aircraft, and a deliberate choice not to run full escorts. A Chinese-owned tanker really was seized. What we don't know yet is whether shippers trust this umbrella enough to move again, whether it holds if Iran pushes harder, or what Tehran's new transit authority becomes 6 months from now. So here's the open question worth sitting with. Can a defensive umbrella actually reopen a strait like this without ever becoming the escort mission it was built to avoid? Tell us what you think happens next.